What if the story of Europe is not the story of civilization rising, but the story of civilization repeatedly collapsing and somehow surviving anyway? For tens of thousands of years, this continent has been a stage for one of the most dramatic experiments in human history. Long before modern nations, before cathedrals, empires, or revolutions, Europe was a frozen wilderness where small bands of hunter-gatherers struggled to survive beneath towering glaciers nearly a mile thick. Yet from those fragile beginnings emerged ideas that would transform the entire world: democracy, philosophy, science, law, and the concept of individual rights. But the path toward those achievements was never smooth. Civilizations rose with astonishing brilliance only to vanish in sudden catastrophe. Cities burned, empires collapsed, entire populations disappeared from the historical record. Again and again, Europe seemed to reach the brink of destruction, only to reinvent itself in ways no one could have predicted. From the mysterious collapse of the Bronze Age to the rise of Rome, from the devastation of the Black Death to the revolutions that reshaped global politics, the history of Europe is not a steady march of progress. It is a relentless cycle of ambition, crisis, reinvention, and survival. And even today, as the continent faces new tensions and uncertainties, one question remains unavoidable. After 50,000 years of upheaval, is Europe finally stable? Or is it simply preparing for its next transformation? Long before Europe became a continent of nations, borders, and cities, it was a harsh and unforgiving wilderness shaped by ice, wind, and survival. Around 50,000 years ago, the first modern humans began moving slowly into this land from Western Asia, following migrating animals across immense distances that sometimes stretched hundreds of miles. They entered a world far different from the Europe we know today. Much of the northern landscape lay buried beneath colossal glaciers, some nearly a mile thick, while the southern regions were dominated by cold grasslands and dense forests filled with dangerous predators. These early people possessed no cities, no written language, and no grand monuments. Yet they carried something far more powerful: the ability to adapt, imagine, and endure. Deep inside limestone caves across the continent, they left behind haunting paintings of animals, hunts, and symbols whose meanings we still struggle to fully understand. These images reveal that even at humanity's earliest stage, people were already reflecting on their place in the world. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the planet began to change. The last ice age slowly loosened its grip as temperatures rose and glaciers retreated northward. Rivers expanded, forests spread, and fertile valleys emerged across lands that had once been locked in ice. Humans followed these shifting landscapes, gradually spreading from the Atlantic coastline nearly 1,500 miles eastward toward the Ural Mountains. For thousands of years, life remained centered on hunting and gathering, until a quiet but revolutionary idea arrived from the Middle East: agriculture. Around 7000 BC, farming began to transform Europe. Fields replaced wilderness, animals were domesticated, and permanent villages appeared. For the first time in human history on this continent, survival was no longer the only goal. Society itself had begun to take root. Civilization rarely appears suddenly. It grows slowly, shaped by geography, trade, and the restless curiosity of human societies searching for opportunity beyond their own horizons. In Europe, that awakening began around the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. By roughly 3000 BC, the island of Crete became home to what historians consider the continent's first advanced civilization, the Minoans. Surrounded by the sea, the Minoans turned outward rather than inward. Their ships traveled hundreds of miles across Mediterranean trade routes, connecting them with Egypt, Anatolia, and the great cultures of the Near East. Through these exchanges came new ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that transformed their society into something remarkably sophisticated for its time. Vast palace complexes rose at places like Knossos, sprawling architectural centers filled with storage chambers, ceremonial halls, and intricate corridors that hinted at a highly organized world of administration and ritual. Bright frescoes covered their walls, depicting athletes leaping over bulls, religious ceremonies, and scenes of everyday life that radiated color and movement. Yet the balance of this early European civilization proved fragile. Around 1600 BC, power began shifting toward mainland Greece, where the Mycenaean civilization emerged more militarized and ambitious than their Minoan predecessors. Mycenaean rulers constructed heavily fortified citadels and expanded their influence across regional trade networks, speaking an early form of the Greek language that would echo through history. But the Bronze Age world would soon face a catastrophe that remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Around 1200 BC, civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost simultaneously. Cities burned, trade routes disintegrated, and populations vanished from the record. For centuries afterward, silence settled over the region in what historians now call the Greek Dark Ages. Yet from this darkness, new Greek city-states would eventually rise, carrying forward ideas that would forever reshape human thought. While the Greek world struggled through cycles of brilliance and internal conflict, another power was quietly rising along the banks of the Tiber River in central Italy. According to legend, Rome was founded in 753 BC by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf in the wilderness. Myth and history intertwine in the origins of Rome, yet the reality that followed was even more remarkable. What began as a modest settlement surrounded by hills gradually transformed into one of the most formidable civilizations the world had ever known. In 509 BC, the Romans overthrew their monarchy and established a republic governed by a senate and elected officials, creating a political system built not solely on royal authority, but on law, citizenship, and civic duty. Over the next several centuries, Rome expanded relentlessly, first across the Italian peninsula and then far beyond it. The decisive turning point came during the brutal Punic Wars against the powerful city of Carthage, conflicts that reshaped the balance of power across the Mediterranean. Victorious but hardened by war, Rome emerged as the dominant force of the ancient world. By the 2nd century AD, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire stretched across nearly 2.3 million square miles, linking together lands from Britain in the northwest to the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa. Along these vast distances, Roman engineers constructed an extraordinary network of roads, over 250,000 miles in total, binding distant provinces into a single administrative system governed by Roman law and the Latin language. Cities flourished across Europe, many of which would become the foundations of modern capitals such as London, Paris, Vienna, and Cologne. This long period of relative stability, known as Pax Romana, allowed culture, philosophy, and commerce to thrive. Yet within this immense empire, another transformation was quietly unfolding as Christianity began spreading among its diverse populations, planting the spiritual seeds that would shape Europe long after Rome itself began to fade. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, Europe did not simply lose an emperor, it lost the central structure that had held together an entire civilization for centuries. Roads remained, cities still stood, and Roman laws echoed faintly in distant provinces, but the political order that once connected millions of people across thousands of miles had fractured almost overnight. Into this vacuum stepped a mosaic of emerging kingdoms formed by migrating Germanic tribes. The Visigoths established rule across the Iberian Peninsula. The Ostrogoths and later Lombards dominated parts of Italy, while the Franks expanded their authority across the lands that would one day become France and Western Germany. In Britain, Roman administration vanished entirely, replaced by incoming Anglo-Saxon groups who formed their own rival kingdoms. To many living through this era, the world must have seemed uncertain and unstable, as if the old pillars of civilization had quietly crumbled. Yet amid the political fragmentation, one institution remained remarkably resilient: the Christian Church. Monasteries preserved literacy and learning, copying manuscripts by candlelight, while much of Europe struggled through centuries of upheaval. Missionaries traveled across forests, mountains, and rivers to convert pagan rulers, slowly weaving Christianity into the social fabric of the continent. One of the most pivotal moments came in 496 AD, when Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity, forging a powerful alliance between monarchy and church that would shape European politics for generations. By the late 8th century, another Frankish ruler, Charlemagne, pushed this transformation even further. Through conquest and diplomacy, he built an empire stretching across much of Western Europe, and in the year 800, the Pope crowned him Emperor of the Romans, symbolically reviving imperial authority in the West. Yet even as new political structures formed, a different force was emerging from the north, the Vikings whose swift ships would soon shake Europe's fragile order. By the beginning of the 14th century, Europe appeared to be entering a period of remarkable prosperity. Populations had grown steadily for generations. New towns were emerging across the continent, and long-distance trade routes connected merchants from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea. Cathedrals soared above medieval skylines, universities flourished with new learning, and a sense of cautious optimism spread through many regions of Europe. Yet beneath this fragile stability lay vulnerabilities that would soon erupt into catastrophe. The first blow came with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when years of relentless rain and failing harvests devastated agricultural production across northern Europe. Crops rotted in flooded fields, food prices soared, and millions faced starvation. Entire communities weakened by hunger became dangerously susceptible to disease, and within a generation an even greater disaster arrived. In 1347, merchant ships sailing from the Black Sea carried an invisible passenger into Mediterranean ports, the plague. Known later as the Black Death, this disease spread with terrifying speed along Europe's trade networks. Within only a few years, it had swept across the continent, killing perhaps 1 out of every 3 people. Cities fell silent, villages were abandoned, and mass graves became grim symbols of a society confronting mortality on an unimaginable scale. Many believed the end of the world had arrived. Yet, history often reveals its most profound transformations in moments of devastation. The enormous loss of life created a severe labor shortage, forcing surviving peasants and workers into positions of new economic leverage. Feudal systems began to weaken, social mobility slowly increased, and in the wealthy trading cities of northern Italy, an intellectual and artistic revival began to take shape. Inspired by the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, the Renaissance ignited a new vision of human potential that would reshape Europe's future. The intellectual awakening sparked by the Renaissance did not remain confined to art and architecture. It gradually evolved into a deeper transformation in how Europeans understood authority, knowledge, and the structure of society itself. By the early 16th century, tensions within the religious world of Europe had begun to intensify. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther publicly challenged the authority of the Catholic Church by publishing his 95 Theses, criticizing practices he believed had strayed far from the original teachings of Christianity. What might once have remained a localized theological dispute instead spread rapidly across the continent thanks to the revolutionary power of the printing press. Luther's arguments ignited the Protestant Reformation, fracturing the religious unity of Western Europe and setting the stage for decades of political and sectarian conflict. Yet amid these divisions, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one driven not by faith but by observation and reason. During the 16th and 17th centuries, scholars across Europe began questioning long-held assumptions about the universe. Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than standing at the center of creation. Galileo Galilei used telescopes to observe the heavens with unprecedented precision, while Johannes Kepler revealed the mathematical laws governing planetary motion. Later, Isaac Newton would unite these discoveries through his laws of motion and universal gravitation, providing a scientific framework that reshaped humanity's understanding of the natural world. These breakthroughs helped ignite a broader intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. Philosophers such as John Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau challenged traditional ideas about monarchy, religion, and political authority, arguing that legitimate government should rest upon the consent and rights of the people. Their ideas did not remain abstract theories. By the late 18th century, they fueled revolutionary movements, most dramatically in France in 1789, where centuries of royal authority collapsed in a wave of political upheaval that would ultimately give rise to the extraordinary ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. The 19th century ushered Europe into an era of unprecedented transformation, as the Industrial Revolution reshaped nearly every aspect of daily life. What had once been largely rural societies began rapidly shifting toward expanding cities filled with factories, railways, and new machines powered by steam and coal. Millions of people left agricultural villages in search of opportunity within these growing industrial centers, where production increased dramatically, but working conditions were often harsh and unforgiving. Industrial power fueled economic expansion, yet it also intensified competition among Europe's rising nation-states. Newly unified countries such as Germany and Italy joined older powers like Britain and France in a race for influence, resources, and global dominance. Across Africa and Asia, European empires expanded aggressively, projecting their power far beyond the continent itself. Beneath this outward confidence, however, tensions were quietly building between rival alliances. In June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of mobilizations that plunged Europe into the devastation of the First World War. What many believed would be a short conflict instead became a 4-year catastrophe marked by trench warfare, industrialized weaponry, and unimaginable loss of life. The war shattered empires and redrew the political map of Europe, yet the fragile peace that followed proved temporary. Economic instability and political resentment created fertile ground for extremist ideologies, and by 1939, the continent once again descended into global conflict during the Second World War. When the fighting ended in 1945, Europe lay physically and emotionally exhausted, soon divided between the opposing spheres of the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Although decades later the fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized a renewed hope for unity, recent tensions remind the world that Europe's long and turbulent story is far from finished. Across 50,000 years of upheaval, Europe has repeatedly stood at the edge of collapse only to rebuild itself in unexpected ways. Empires have risen and vanished. Ideas have shattered old orders, and entire generations have endured wars, revolutions, and transformation on a scale few other regions have experienced. Yet from this long cycle of destruction and reinvention emerged many of the political systems, cultural traditions, and intellectual foundations that continue to shape the modern world. Today, Europe remains a mosaic of nations bound together by shared history and fragile cooperation. The question that lingers is timeless. Is this continent finally entering an age of lasting stability, or simply preparing for another chapter of change? For thousands of years, Europe has been a mirror reflecting both the brilliance and the dangers of human civilization. Empires promised stability, yet often collapsed under their own ambition. Revolutions fought for freedom, but sometimes unleashed chaos. And again, societies discovered that progress is never permanent. It must be protected, questioned, and rebuilt by each generation. The history of Europe reminds us that prosperity, peace, and democratic values are not inevitable outcomes of history, but fragile achievements shaped by human choices. For modern audiences, especially in a rapidly changing world, the deeper lesson is clear: the forces that once divided nations fear power, struggles, and unchecked ambition still exist today. Understanding history is not just about remembering the past. It is about recognizing the patterns that shape our future. If you found this journey through Europe's history insightful, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, share it with someone curious about the past, and subscribe for more deep explorations into the stories that shaped our world.